Welcome to another episode of the Quadruple D. And there's some big news today. The big ugly bill has apparently passed, and it will soon be signed into law. And interestingly enough, for some reason, they trotted out Bill O'Reilly, the former Fox News doofus, to chime in on the big ugly bill. And I will get around to that in a little while here. And remember, Bill O'Reilly's the moron who claimed gay marriage could lead to marriages between humans and goats, ducks, dolphins, and turtles. Not necessarily in that order, maybe, but that was one of the things he claimed. So yeah, he is a bigoted moron. I don't know why people pay attention to him. There are some people out there who would say that I shouldn't be paying attention to him. But you know what? I am a bit stereotypically liberal over here, so if Bill O'Reilly wants to marry a snapping turtle or a dolphin or a duck or a goat, he can go right on ahead and do that. Meanwhile, the rest of us were overwhelmingly talking about marriage between consenting legal adult human beings, but I just brought that up as a little bit of a flashback to remind you of what kind of expert analysis that Bill O'Reilly has in store for people so much of the time. But first, before I look at Bill O'Reilly and what he had to say, I want to look at what is in that big, hideous bill that is most certainly going to be signed into law. President Trump's sweeping so called One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OBBA. Wait, OBBBA. It's a massive tax and spending package that definitely sparked some fierce debate. Its flagship feature is the permanent extension of President Trump's 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which would freeze marginal income tax brackets at a regressive level. So when they say things like freeze or make permanent, it's a little bit of a lie, right? Because when somebody else gets in power, if the overwhelming majority of people have the will, they can make something that is called permanent just go away, perhaps overnight. But that's one of the things they're saying about this is that it would freeze things in place, make them permanent or whatever. But in fact, the very title of One Big Beautiful Bill Act, it almost sounds sarcastic, doesn't it? It's like they are winking at people with that title because they know there is nothing beautiful about it. They know that hideous things are in store here with its passage. The OBBBA, which is, again, annoying to even say, but it has been explained by CNN, quote, for many Medicaid enrollees, the biggest impact would be the new work requirement. Certain able bodied Americans ages 19 to 64 who are enrolled through the Medicaid expansion would have to work, volunteer, attend school, or participate in job training at least 80 hours a month. The mandate would also apply to parents of children ages 14 and older. In other words, now this is no longer the CNN quote, this is me. In other words, the classic GOP formula of millionaires and billionaires telling average Americans they need to be out there working more for less, jump through more hoops if you want to have access to anything. And frankly, at this point, it's amazing that they just haven't gotten rid of every type of benefit that the average American could earn. I'm surprised they even still have wage labor at this point and just haven't totally regressed to slavery for, the masses in general. But I guess they haven't taken things quite so far yet. But I'm sure they're working on it. They're working on bringing back child labor, and I, if I'm correct, if I remember correctly, they are trying to bring back things like asbestos and stuff like that too. Now, correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I've I've seen that report somewhere. I swear that they're working on bringing back asbestos. So one thing that at least sounds good in the ugly bill is what CNN explains. Again, I'm going to quote from them. Many workers who receive tips or overtime compensation would get a tax break through 2028. However, this is me again, that is most certainly actually a scam that happens to sound good. Sorry, I had to take a drink of water. So why would some call it a scam? There is limited benefit for low wage workers with the tips thing. The core critique is that many low wage tipped workers already earn too little to owe federal income tax, meaning the proposed deduction wouldn't benefit them. So the critics contend that a significant portion of low wage workers aren't in tipped occupations to begin with. So it benefits higher earners more. There's the tax deduction on tips would disproportionately help higher earning workers in tipped professions. And the potential negative impact on worker compensation is there too. Concerns have been raised that this policy could incentivize employers to rely even more heavily on tipping, potentially hindering efforts to raise the federal minimum wage or base pay for service workers. So it's undercutting minimum wage efforts by subsidizing tipping through the federal tax code. The policy is potentially undermining initiatives to establish a fairer minimum wage system. And it's also potentially depleting tax revenue. Ending tip taxation could result in a loss of government revenue that could otherwise be used for public services. So the no tax on tips proposal absolutely sounds like a scam if you actually look into what it is, because it primarily benefits higher earners rather than the lowest wage workers and could have negative consequences for worker pay and tax revenue. So it's something that sounds good, because no tax on tips. It just sounds good, right? But it's actually not as good as it sounds if you really think about what it actually does. Anyway, moving on to offset the massive tax cuts, what do the Republicans do? Well, the bill, which again is pretty much a law now, it plans to ramp up military and border spending because, of course, you have to you have to cut everything, but you can't cut the military. So you're not actually cutting everything. You gotta prioritize bombing people, shooting people, throwing them in cages, beating them, torturing them, all that kind of stuff. Basically, anything that harms people is good, and anything that actually helps people is bad. So, immigration enforcement budgets, they're going to go up. Meanwhile, they're going to enact deep cuts to Medicaid, SNAP, food stamps, and green energy programs because you got to be fully regressive. You can't have alternative energy start to receive the sort of benefits that the fossil fuel industry will receive. So the Congressional Budget Office estimates the net impact at a $3.3 trillion addition to the deficit over 10 years, though other groups suggest it may hit $4 trillion or more. So that's out of the way. I've explained that, so you get a rough idea of what's in there. I haven't gone over everything, but now I'm going to get to the Bill O'Reilly section as promised. So, conservative pundit and doofus Bill O'Reilly defended the bill's supposed populist appeal. He told News Nation's Chris Cuomo, who is himself a horrible person overall, Anyway, he said the win is that it, or hold on, the win is that he gets an economy that will make Republicans win the midterms, claiming the cuts will doom the economy if they expire. But Democrats and fiscal analysis will prove that the elites stand to gain the most. This is me talking. I'm no longer quoting O'Reilly. The elites are going to gain the most, and lower income households will be hit hardest by cuts to social programs. The Tax Foundation reports higher income taxpayers benefiting disproportionately, and that is by intent of design. The OBBBA exemplifies Republican priorities, funneling wealth upward, expanding coercive power with the military and border controls, and punishing the vulnerable under the guise of deficit discipline, all while disguising massive giveaways to the rich using accounting technicalities. This isn't pro growth, it's a plutocratic enrichment financed by escalating public debt. So the bill's timing, or the law's timing, pushed just before July 4th, suggests political theater as well. So another cynical aspect to it. House Republicans rammed it through amid internal divisions, and the Senate narrowly passed it through a VP tiebreaker, with Vice President Vance shifting the vote into a reality. And of course, now it has passed. And there's almost no chance that Donald Trump would not sign this stupid piece of shit thing into the law, or into law. I don't know why I said into the law, but the law of the land, I guess I'll put it like that. But the thing is just going to be bad. We're going to see a lot of ballooning deficit problem, and these people, they sometimes claim to be deficit hawks. So, what it all means is that in the short term, the best case scenario from this is that households may see modest bumps in take home pay, but that is going to be indeed modest. The long term is that the persistent deficits will threaten public services, raise interest burdens, and empower creditor institutions, reducing democratic control and increasing state coercion that benefits the wealthy. It is indeed benefiting the ruling class. This mega bill isn't merely economic policy, it's political maneuvering using deficit financing, social cuts, and militarization to entrench power. The result is a fragile economy propped up by debt, with everyday people squeezed, while the state grows stronger and more overtly fascistic. And, that's a real thing that just happened. We're going to see it become law. Now, moving on to section 2 of this episode, I call it the peripheral poop head of the week. And we're looking at a dead guy named Roger Ailes. So he was somebody who was obviously involved in Bill O'Reilly's career, being that Bill O'Reilly was a Fox News guy. So, he was familiar with Roger Ailes. So that's how he ties into the previous segment of the episode. So, who was Roger Ailes? Heavily hemophilic from childhood, diagnosed at 2 after a bleeding tongue incident, Roger Eugene Ailes lived every day under the looming threat of a simple injury turning fatal. Despite early warnings that hemophiliacs rarely lived past 11, Ailes survived into his late 70s. He had lifelong joint damage and arthritis, but on May 10th, 2017, he suffered a fall at his Palm Beach home that triggered a lethal subdural hematoma, and hemophilia worsened the bleeding, and he died 8 days later. at the age of 77, and there was no foul play. But after all that information that might make you feel bad for the guy, he was nonetheless rotten to the core. And here's why he was basically a villain, at least in my opinion. So, Ailes built a media empire rooted in conservative so called populism. His career began behind the camera as producer of The Mike Douglas Show, where he turned heads advising Richard Nixon on the power of TV. He said television is not a gimmick. If you think it is, you'll lose again. In 1968, at age 28, he served as Nixon's TV consultant and later advised Reagan and George H.W. Bush. From 1975 to 1991, he shaped GOP strategy through media consulting. So, very much a powerful figure behind the scenes, and that's why he was a peripheral poophead, if you will. He's not necessarily a household name. A lot of people have probably never even thought of him, even if they're at least slightly attuned to political topics. They probably never thought that often about Roger Ailes. But in October 1996, Ailes co founded Fox News under Rupert Murdoch, churning a partisan information ecosystem. Branded laughably as fair and balanced, the network aggressively mined cultural fear, fear of immigration, ooh, the spooky immigrants, Islam, and racialized anxieties, and also things like the fear of a war on Christmas, because that's something that they famously have pushed almost every single holiday season, claiming that there's a war on Christmas, even though to this day, after living for 43 years, I have not experienced this war on Christmas. In fact, people still seem to love Santa Claus. I I know plenty of kids out there still look forward to getting those presents under their Christmas tree, and they like all those Christmas tunes and all that kind of stuff. I myself enjoyed getting Christmas presents, despite the fact that I no longer believe in Santa Claus. I have some positive memories of the whole season. So, anyway, because of stuff like that, its audience was fueled on rage and grievance and total lies and nonsense. A 2006 study found Fox's launch shifted vote shares in presidential and Senate races. And by 2004, it was the top cable network on election night. And by 2016, a majority of Trump voters named it their most trusted source. So, ick. Ailes represents media centralization as a tool of elite control. He transformed what was often professional journalism before into blatant propaganda. The media landscape became pretty much nothing but an opinion landscape, and that in turn shapes most people into being opinionated rather than informed. So if you're wondering why I am opinionated on this podcast, for example, well, it's at least somewhat because of the media environment that has been shaped by Fox News and other right wing media outlets. They're making issues more about opinions and hysteria and fear and partisan hackery kind of stuff rather than just focusing on what issues are important and what policies are best. It's all about leveraging television to engineer consent and manipulate populist outrage. So it was a partisan hackery factory and still is. Ailes' blueprint, fear driven, identity bound, and monetized, set a template echoed across right wing media ecosystems. And that includes the online media, of course, and social media. And under his leadership, Fox News became less a news source than a propaganda machine that deepened polarization and fortified the ruling class's ideological dominance. So make no mistake here, this is a ruling class phenomenon, and it is about using ideology to control the idiot masses and to shape public opinion, to sort of divide and conquer the population, and to make them hear or hear the agendas of far right extremists over common sense, and that includes targeting people who are actually who actually have less power than the average American citizen, like the average immigrant to the United States. You know, making it sound like they're the biggest threat that this country faces, when of course they tend to have even less of a say than the average American citizen in any city or town in the United States. You know, they're supposed to be the big boogeyman. But of course, well, think of it this way: if so many of them were violent gangsters and serial killers and terrorists and all that kind of stuff, if so many immigrants were like that, do you really think that ICE would be going about their chosen tasks without facing a bloody battle on its hands? Do you really think there would be no terrorism against the ICE agents, or no street brawls or whatever? Because for the most part, the violence is overwhelmingly coming from ICE, right? There aren't even that many news reports of people physically fighting back. So if so many of these immigrants were like the worst of the worst, the most violent people imaginable, you would think it would be a bloodbath, and that ICE would almost be on the defensive, right? We're told that there's millions of these supposed terrorists, and I guess Hannibal Lecters that are such a threat. And of course the lie about the Haitian immigrants in Ohio, that they were eating cats and dogs, just this disgusting and frankly racist propaganda that was being shoveled down Americans' throats, which frankly it's a shame that so many people are stupid enough that they believe that stuff. But what can you say? You've been propagandized and lied to your entire life. You're going to believe a lot of silly things. And again, that's part of the ideological dominance that these sorts of news networks are seeking. They want to hoodwink people and make the vulnerable even more vulnerable. And the downfall of Roger Ailes came just as his platform peaked. By July 2016, multiple former Fox women, most notably Gretchen Carlson, Megyn Kelly, and Andrea Tantaros, accused Ailes of serial sexual harassment within a deeply misogynistic corporate culture. So that's another thing about Fox News, of course. They, as part of their propaganda, they created a deeply misogynistic work environment too, because there's a lot of bashing of women. And if you've watched Fox News, you'll see that they tend to scoff at people like AOC especially, and it, it's a lot of racism too. So Ailes engineered a media political apparatus that weaponized television to consolidate conservative power and control narratives, and frankly make people stupider. His rise and fall showcase how hierarchical structures and centralized media enable authoritarian control, distort public perception and discourse, and repress accountability at a terrible cost, both socially and personally. So, okay, who's the fetid fever dream flashback of the week for the third segment of this show within a show called the Quadruple D? Well, that is none other than Rudy Giuliani. So why am I bringing him up? Because Roger Ailes was actually a media operative for Rudy Giuliani's 1989 New York City mayoral election. So Rudy Giuliani once said pretty much the stupidest thing ever. He said, quote, before Barack Obama came along, we didn't have any successful radical Islamic terrorist attack inside the United States. So think about that. It's one of the dumbest things any human being has ever said. Because, of course, what happened? September 11th. Who was mayor of the city where September 11th happened? Wow, that was Rudy Giuliani. So, truly one of the dumbest things any person has ever said. But that's actually not the fetid fever dream flashback of the week. It's not the worst thing that he has done. The biggest scandal involving Giuliani is, in most people's opinions, probably his indictment and disbarment proceedings linked to attempts to overturn the 2020 US presidential election, particularly his role in spreading false claims of voter fraud and working with Donald Trump or Donaldo Trumpolini to undermine the electoral process. So, just a quick reminder of what that included: promoting baseless conspiracy theories about voting machines and election fraud, involvement in efforts to pressure state officials to overturn certified results, participating in the coordination of fake electors in swing states, which obviously was a no no. You shouldn't do that. And being named a co conspirator in multiple lawsuits and criminal cases, including those led by the Department of Justice and the Georgia District Attorney. So he had his law license suspended in New York and Washington, D.C. He was sued by Dominion Voting Systems and Smartmatic for defamation. And he also faced other scandals, including Ukraine interference. He was acting as an unofficial diplomat to dig up dirt on Joe Biden's son Hunter, which tied into Trump's first impeachment. And of course, he's alleged to be an alcoholic and engage in inappropriate behavior, and that includes lawsuits accusing him of sexual misconduct. So, ironically, this this party of law and order, as I've said before, feeds the narratives of the villainous anarchist types out there who actually criticize government and point out the hypocrisy of things like law and order. So, uh, from an anarchist perspective, from the perspective of a deviant, no good anarchist, somebody who's skeptical of state authority, hierarchical power, and the legitimacy of electoral politics, Giuliani's scandal isn't just about a fall from grace, it's a symptom of systemic rot. He debunks the myth of rule of law. Giuliani built his reputation on law and order politics, especially as New York City mayor and a federal prosecutor. So, a deviant anarchist would view his lawfare tactics and later law breaking as classic hypocrisy. And sure enough, it was and still is. The law being a tool of the powerful, selectively enforced, and ultimately meaningless when those in power decide it no longer serves them. And that is, again, exactly what unfolded here. We also see under the ideology of Giuliani the electoral democracy being used as a shell game. His role in trying to overturn a democratic election really demonstrates what the villainous anarchists would often argue, that electoral politics is not sacred or fair, it's power games between ruling elites. So Giuliani wasn't upending some noble system, he was pulling back the curtain on how quickly democracy is abandoned when it threatens elite interests. And indeed, just as a reminder, these are elite interests. They're not the interests of Joe Sixpack sitting at the corner bar, drinking away his sorrows and also his paycheck, of course. No, these are elite interests, millionaires and billionaires and fascists, oligarchs, those types. So there's also the cult of personality and the corruption of office. Giuliani's fall is not unique, but predictable. The bad, nasty anarchist types reject the idea that any individual, no matter how principled they claim to be, can hold vast centralized power without being corrupted. Giuliani is what the system produces, a loyal enforcer turned rogue operator serving power and not people. So you've also got the distraction from the deeper structural issues at hand. Mainstream outrage over Giuliani often focuses on legality and propriety, but a cynical anarchist critique would go deeper. The entire political and legal structure enables such behavior. It's not a glitch, it's the system largely working as designed. Giuliani's scandal is just one flare up in a much larger architecture of authoritarianism, propaganda, and elite impunity. Now, I am personally not as cynical as to say that there's total impunity, because occasionally, some person in power does get held accountable. So I'm not quite as jaded as to be laying out these types of views as if there's some absolutist formula, because occasionally there is a little bit of accountability, but not that much, and it's normally after some immense public pressure. So Giuliani's scandalous behavior isn't shocking. It's really something to be expected. He was a loyal agent of state violence, repression, and elite manipulation, and when the rules didn't suit the goals of his faction, he tried to break them. That's not really a deviation from the norm. It is the norm, just more naked than usual. And I kind of regret using the word naked in association with Giuliani. So, I apologize for putting that combination of elements out there. But nevertheless, the Giuliani story is a story of exposed corruption and the rise and fall of idiocy made normal.